Alright, here we are with the final part of our tutorial. Last time we created our character movement, it was all going swimmingly, but then whenever we created our jump button, our character just flies straight up into the air, which is a problem. We're going to try and solve that problem by detecting if the character is on the ground or not, and for that we're going to need to keep track of whether we're on the ground. We'll do that with a bool variable, let's say is on the ground. So this value, when it's true, means that our character is on the ground, and when it's false, they're not on the ground. We're going to add this to our if statement by using the double ampersand, or however you're supposed to pronounce that, these two little symbols inside our if statement, and then we're going to check not only if we're pressing the space bar, but also if we are on the ground. So this value must be true, and this value must be true for us to jump. Now when we run the game, you'll be able to see that the bool is false. It doesn't have a little tick bar on it. And so we won't be able to jump, which is fair enough. The next thing we need to do is actually inform our value by having some way of determining whether our character is on the ground or not. And to do that, we'll need to add another element to our player object. In this case, we're going to right click and create a cube. We can also just do this by creating a cube and then dragging it inside the transform of the player. What we're doing here is creating a child so that as the player moves around, this object will move around with it. We're going to make it slightly smaller and we'll stick it at the bottom of our character so that we can detect whether the character is on the ground or not by the collider that's on the bottom of this character. We're going to turn off our mesh renderer so that we don't see this object because we're just using it for its collider. And then finally, we don't actually want the player to collide with objects. We just want this collision to detect if there's an object that it's intersecting with. So we're going to use this isTrigger tick box on the collider of our cube that we've attached to the bottom of our player. Finally, we're going to add a new script and we'll call this something like ground detection, and this is going to be a new script that we're going to create and add to the cube that is attached to our player. Just like we have our start method and our update method, which are methods that come automatically with Unity, another method that we have is this on trigger enter. And whenever we autofill and we go down and press the enter button, you'll see that a whole bunch of other stuff gets filled out for us. This collider other, for example. We might want to change this from private to public. In this case, it won't matter. And finally, we're also going to want our on trigger, but this time instead of on trigger enter, on trigger exit. And these are going to happen. The code inside here will execute whenever our collider enters something. In this case, we want it to trigger whenever it enters the platform, and that will allow us to affect this variable is on the ground. But to do that, we need our two classes, our two scripts to interact with each other, which means we'll need a variable, and this type will be of player movement. Let's go ahead and create that, public player movement, and we'll just call it something like player. And now using this variable, we'll be able to communicate from the ground detection to the player movement. Whenever the trigger enters, we're going to set is grounded to be true. And whenever we exit, so that will be us jumping and the ground leaving us, we'll say that it's now false. Ugh, can't spell false. There we go. Let's save that out. Now there's one thing we need to do, which is actually set up our variables. In this case, we're going to have to drag the object, which has got the player movement script on it, and drag it and drop it into our player variable. Now, hopefully, whenever we run the game, our object will only be on the ground when we are on the ground. So what I'm trying to do here is play the game and also look at our variable changing over time. We're going to click on maximize on play so that that isn't the case anymore, and that way whenever I resume the game, the whole screen isn't filled with our game view. So let's move around. We can see is on the ground is true. Whenever I jump, is on the ground is now false. However, we are still flying up into the air, so we've got a problem. Maybe simply our direction is far too high. So let's go ahead and change that to 1. Aha! That looks a lot better now that our value is something realistic. And I can now test to see if this is working by hitting the spacebar over and over again and see that I can only jump whenever I'm on the ground. Perfect. The last thing we want to do, though, is add some failure state. In this case, we're going to want to try to fail the character or destroy them whenever they hit this orange lava. So, just like our other collider, we're going to go ahead and make the collision on this lava is trigger, and we're going to add a lava script. Now, whenever an object enters the lava, we want it to be destroyed. In this case, the player is the only object that can enter the lava at the moment. So we're going to go ahead and copy this method, which is onTriggerEnter, just for sake of ease. But this time, instead of telling the player is on the ground, we're going to want to destroy the player. In this case, the player will be the argument for the destroy function. Oh, even I make typos all the time. In this case, it's not destroy, it's destroy. There we go. Now it's telling us that the player, it has a problem with this. It's got an error, and that's because we also need to declare the player as a variable inside this lava script, even though it already exists in the player ground detection script. This time, though, instead of the player being a player movement script that we're trying to interact with, we want this to be a game object variable. And this is because whenever we want to destroy our player, we want to destroy the whole object, not just the script that's on it. Let's go ahead and save and see what happens whenever our character falls into the lava. Nothing. So we've clearly got a problem here. Let's try to understand what might have caused this problem. We've got our lava script, but the player is not set to any particular game object, so it doesn't know what to delete. In this case, we're going to drag this cylinder in, and hopefully now the cylinder will be deleted whenever our player falls into the lava. There it goes, just disappears. Not exactly very spectacular, but we're just building the fundamentals of gameplay here at the moment, and all of the fancy effects can come later. The last thing we want to do is actually, let's do a little bit of level design. Let's add some platforms so that we can actually have a chance of jumping over these platforms and avoiding our lava. And this will depend on things like the speed of the player, the jump height. In this case, it looks like I've got something that is feasible for the character to jump across. We can tweak those values of player movement and jumping speeds and then set up our platforms in a more interesting fashion, right? I could maybe have this platform go up here and we can just about jump up to it. Go wild with your designs. Finally, we're going to try to have our character be followed by the camera so that we're not constrained to something that fits within this particular view of our scene. We can have a level that stretches on continuously. Well, one thing we can do is we can just take our main character and make it a child of our player object. In this case, as the player moves, so does the camera. However, we'll want to set up our camera initially so that the player is in the center of the screen, so that that relative movement keeps the player in the center of the screen rather than with the weird offset that we had there earlier. All right, this looks better. However, whenever our character falls in the lava, because the camera is attached to the player and we're destroying the player, the camera now is gone, so it can't render anything. And that's not what we want. We want our camera to be separate. So we need to find some way of the character following the player without being a child of it. For this, we're going to add our last script, which will be like the camera movement or something like that. Sometimes it doesn't open the correct script automatically, so we're just going to go back, double click on our script here. So we want it to follow the position of the camera. But one thing that we also can do is perhaps only follow the X position of the camera, of the player rather, so that as the player jumps, the camera doesn't move up and down, but the camera does move left and right to follow the player. So we're going to go ahead and create another version of our player variable. In this case, we want it to be a game object again, because we're following the position of that game object. And then we're also going to need our temporary vector3 so that we can use this to store the position of the player, only use the x-axis, and then set our camera to that value. And that is similar to how we want to retain the y-axis of our player movement. We want to retain the y-axis of our camera. So we're just going to call this something like temp movement. Maybe there's a better name I could come up with this variable, but that's all I've got for now. You can call your variables anything you want, but ultimately you want to call them something that reminds you of what they're for. In this case, we're going to go ahead and first of all set our temporary movement to the player's transform.position. And that is the position that you see here in the transform component of the object. Then we want to go ahead and retain only the X position of our temporary movement, which means that instead of setting its entirety of its values, we only want to set the X value of that position. Finally, we're going to go ahead and set our own transform.position of the object this script is attached to our temporary movement. But this isn't going to work, and I'll explain why in a moment. But let's have a look and see what that looks like. Well, we have an unassigned reference exception, which is our classic mistake of not setting the object. So we need to go ahead and grab our cylinder again, stick it in our variable. Let's go ahead and run the game and see what happens. Well, our camera it looks like everything's disappeared, and that's because our camera has set its z-axis to the position of this object as well. Our temporary movement value, therefore, needs to have a higher z value so that we can see our character from farther than right in front of them. In this case, it looks like it's actually a minus value. And perhaps our temporary value should be slightly above it as well. So now that we've got this offset and we're just changing the x-axis based on the character's movement, we can finally got our version of the character which doesn't follow whenever we jump, but does follow as we move left and right. Just make sure you don't do what I just did, which is change the values of a variable while you're playing the game. Whenever you stop playing the game, the values of those variables reset to what they were before. So we're going to have to make sure that we change those values when we're not running the game, so that they are actually saved. There we go. That looks good to me. And that's the end of the tutorial. See, if you've got this far, then congratulations, because we just did a whole bunch of stuff. Can you create a slightly more interesting platforming challenge? Can you tweak around with the values of movement and jumping? Maybe you want a lower jump, 0.5. This makes jumping a bit more difficult, and therefore you can place your platforms to fit that new movement.